As I hinted in the abstract, my talk is in part inspired by Max Weber's famous lecture, Science as Vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf. And for those of you who are not familiar with Weber, let me just say a few words about the speech, which I'll be kind of, which will be kind of backstage presence for my talk. The term Beruf has the everyday meaning of profession, but it also evokes the theological idea of a calling, since it's rooted in the word rufen, to call, which is why the word is conventionally translated as vocation, from the Latin vocare, to call. Weber is well aware of this. In his most renowned book, The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, he makes note of the religious origins and timbre of the word as a task given by God. In particular, he stresses the Calvinist notion of a vocation as, quote, a command of God to an individual to work his glory, unquote. In the science lecture, Weber uses hingeben with respect to someone who devotes his life, who gives his life over to science. So the young scholar gives herself to study as someone might give herself to her lover. Vocation is thus both active and passive. One gives oneself freely to that which beckons, but that act of submission requires a great force of will to become one with the caller. It is a defining act, something that the individual, by performing it, expresses who she is. Thus, there's nothing of the instrumental in following a calling, the activity of a vocation in this sense. Chosen as an end in itself, a vocation is ultimately an ethical choice or decision. It has to do with what the person considers to be of the utmost value. It is a free choice to commit oneself to what one deems most necessary in order to become who one is. I won't rehearse Weber's beautiful and compelling account of the conditions and goals of scientific activities, nor will I draw extensive parallels to art, although in certain respects one might. Rather, as I hinted in the abstract, I will follow his lead insofar as I will begin my talk, not by offering some similarly high-minded account of the inner life of the artist, but rather by describing the external circumstances for the activity of producing art today. What form does art take as a profession? In practical terms, this amounts to what is the situation of the aspiring artist intent on a career as a painter, photographer, choreographer, playwright, or poet? In order to do that, I will set the stage by making a few preliminary remarks about my own experience of being asked to talk about such matters. Truth to tell, I've often been asked in a variety of contexts to say something about the value of art, culture, and the humanities. Indeed, the request is often formulated in just those terms. Art, culture, and humanities. Art, culture, and the humanities. All said, as it were, in a single breath. Now, this very fact that these terms seem always to be in each other's company has from time to time made me feel uncertain, perplexed even. I suppose that this is because, on the face of it, it's not entirely clear to me that my own activities as an academic philosopher, teaching and scholarship in philosophy, have more in common with theater, dance performance, or the visual arts than, say, those of an academic astronomer or political scientist. That said, why am I then so often asked to speak about the importance of aesthetic processes in schools, or the contribution of drama to instilling a democratic sensibility, or the potential of dance for economic development in a region? My guess is that the answer is twofold. The first explanation is rather banal. Most people just really don't understand what humanists do, and all the less so when it comes to philosophers. The second explanation is more interesting, and it has to do with a certain conception of what makes something valuable, about what it means to say that something is important. We live in an era, or at least it seems to me, when art and culture, but also aesthetic theory and criticism, are seen less and less as a counterforce to prevailing attitudes and assumptions, or even as an independent countervailing possibility or potential within society. Instead, art and culture are, as it were, justified, not in their own right, but on the basis of essentially economic and political considerations, effects they are thought to help achieve. So those who defend art, culture, and the humanities seem to succumb to the temptation to assimilate artistic values to social ones. So we get cultural entrepreneurs who make the case that culture, in some broad sense, is indispensable for sustainable social and economic development. And politicians have listened to the arguments. One might say that the politicians have discovered culture. In particular, they've noticed the positive economic effects that a vital artistic environment seems to have on cities. The voice perhaps most notably associated with this argument is the American urban studies theorist and consultant Richard Florida, whose research was thought to confirm the hypothesis that there is a strong correlation between a high concentration of technology artists and a group he called high bohemians on the one hand, and economic growth and sustainability on the other. Florida explained this phenomenon by reference to something he called the creative class, whose presence engenders an open and dynamic environment, which in turn attracts more creative types, and therewith business opportunities and investments. His advice to urban policymakers is that they should focus less on infrastructural projects such as shopping malls and sports arenas, and more on attracting talented individuals to live and work in their cities. In books such as The Rise of the Creative Class, Cities and the Creative Class, and The Flight of the Creative Class, Florida advocates social and economic planning revolving around what he calls the 3 T's: technology, tolerance, and talent. Future economic development, Florida argued, will naturally lead to inequalities and a widening gap between regions. The political polarization that we've seen in the US, France, and the UK is a sign of this, in his view. Brexiteers, Trump supporters, and Rassemblement National voters are to be found largely in those areas characterized by lower educational levels and less advantageous professional and financial prospects, places that have already lost or desperately clinging on to dying industries and livelihoods. Florida's claims have been criticized for being colored by ideology, and even his dad and methods have been called into question. He furthermore has himself retracted a number of these ideas. But nonetheless, his influence as a representative of a certain idea of the value of art and culture can hardly be overstated, as this view has been, and to a great extent still is, dominant among those who hope to bolster the status of culture in society and see to it that it's provided the resources it merits and requires. I'm not an economist, so I won't venture into discussion about the economics involved here. But I do want to remind you that the rationale behind all of this is market psychology, a rationale that does not take into any serious account the question, apart from its social economic effects, one way or the other, what is the aim, the essential task, the function of art and culture? In what follows, I will now switch our focus away from these outer circumstances delimiting what is currently expected of artists and the cultural sphere. That is, away from the social and economic values and norms in which artistic activity is embedded, in order to contemplate the inner strivings, one might say, of the artistic endeavor. You might hear echoes of Daniela's talk. I will return to the previous century for guidance from a few cultural critics whose names are sadly all but forgotten by many, but whose thoughts about the autonomy of art and the intrinsic value of culture are as relevant as they were at the time, perhaps more so. The idea that culture in general, and art in particular, can, even ought to, contribute to social functions, contribute to right-mindedness politically, a sense of community socially, and even economic growth and stability, they're not new. One period when the hopes and expectations placed on art for economics and politics was especially, one period where it was especially great was during the first decades of the 20th century, especially in Russia and Central Europe. Already then, some cultural critics in Europe were concerned about the idea that the value of art and culture somehow is embedded in its political and economic utility, that this idea was reductionist and actually ran the risk of distorting what art can, when it's at its best, can actually do, which no other form of human action or human or artifact can achieve. This criticism came from a variety of from various corners, and in part on the basis of different theoretical assumptions, but they all share the idea that art, that literature, music, drama, dance, sculpture, cannot be reduced to some kind of beautiful package for containing a moral or political message and still remain art. A few of the most noted of these thinkers were the Russian literary and linguistic theorists, Yuri Tynyanov, Roman Jakobson, Viktor Shklovsky, the Czech structuralist Jan Mikurovsky, the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the Spanish existentialist philosopher Ortega y Gasset, the German-American political philosopher Hannah Arendt, and the American new critic Clent Brooks. An insight that they, among others, shared was that modern art is characterized and must be characterized by this, that its significant content, its meaningful content, is its form. And this is why many of these people are called, in particular the Russian theorists and the American new critics, this is why they're called formalists. The idea is that the artistic use of form brings about a new perception in the reader, the listener, the spectator, a recognition or awareness that doesn't usually arise, or at least not for the most part. For the most part, actually can't arise in everyday life. And just this new way of seeing that the artist can bring about in the public constitutes the central and guiding principle of art, is its sine qua non. Now, this new way of seeing might lead to a dramatic, even revolutionary change in the viewer's political or moral point of view, but in that case, it's in him that occurs, not in the work of art. I can't really go into a nuanced discussion of the similarities and dissimilarities between the arguments and examples that I'm basing this on, but we can talk about it if you'd like later. Instead, what I'll focus on in the rest of this paper is an attempt to sketch some of the themes that I think are still relevant for us to consider when we're reflecting on how art is used and valued today. One of the greatest names among the so-called formalists was the Russian literary theorist and linguist Viktor Shklovsky. Shklovsky thought that it was pretty common idea at the time that art is thinking in images, that art is symbolic. But he questioned what this actually means. And he distinguished between two kinds of images. Images that are used as a practical means or instrument for thought, in order to put together different things in one and the same thought. That on the one hand. On the other hand, poetic images, those which intensify our impressions. Now, he thought that practical language exists for the purpose of economization, to think quickly and effectively, to save energy, and effort, while the poetic language, which is the language of art, its aim is almost the opposite. Rather than economizing, the point is to loiter, to enrich, to complicate. In practical language use, language is a means to an end. The point is that you want to keep doing whatever you're doing. You're trying to be efficient in your thinking. He calls this in other places an algebrization, right? You use something to represent something else in order to go quickly to get to what you want to do, which is to solve your problem. But his thought is that in contrast to this practical language, rather than rushing ahead, you should be pulling back. So poetic language pushes us back. In practical language, it's not just the language itself, but perception, our thinking, even our actions become automated. It goes quickly. Life itself becomes just kind of this static of things happening around us and to us. And actual signals, meaningful signs kind of get lost in the static. So for the formalists, the greatness of art is its capacity to interrupt, to break through the static, to alienate us from our routines, from everything that is so habitual, unnoticed, and assumed that we're not even aware of how images and representations form our way of seeing the world and even being in it and thinking about it. And in that respect, art can raise consciousness. Through the artist's unexpected use of an expression, his ways, his composition, the way he organizes his language, he can it makes this automated, routine, habitual way of reading impossible. You're kind of forced to loiter, to figure out what's happening. What does this mean? Why? And it makes you hesitate. It surprises you, and the surprise forces you to hesitate. You see something with new eyes, as it were, with fresh eyes. So you actually see rather than recognize the familiar. So the aim with the form, with expression, with the image, is to raise things, raise whatever the phenomenon or the appearance out of its normal, habitual, perceptive mode into a new state of perception in the viewer or the reader. According to Shklovsky, this is the way in which art is everywhere and always liberating, because it liberates us from automation. It re-establishes our perception of life as a perception. We feel things. As he says, the artist shows us that a stone is a stone, that it's made of stone. And in doing that, to make us feel the stoniness of the stone, that's art. But in order to do that, art has to prevent this automatic, perpetual, habitual thinking, this routinization of thought, from just continuing as it normally does. So in order to do that, it can't be a part of our everyday operations to get things done. It should actually make it more difficult. It should put on the brakes, as it were, so that we can't just continue. It should actually complicate in the sense of interrupt and make difficult by, as Aristotle would say, speaking a foreign language, a language that elicits surprise and perhaps even confusion. He actually calls this this slowing down in the English translation for retardation, and he calls it a general law for art, or general principle for art. On a similar view of the essence of art, another art theorist, the Czech Květoslav Chvátik, criticized all attempts to understand art in terms of its role in social, political, or economic life. He thought that every attempt to reduce artistic creativity, to reduce the content of the artistic endeavor to something outside of art, actually limits what is possible to do, what the actual possible content of the artwork can be. And furthermore, to do that, to make art a part of this our everyday social life of consumption, production, consumption, distribution, to do all of that is actually, in essence, to liquidate art as an independent part of human life and culture. The meaning of artistic activity, Chvátik argues, is just that it won't let itself be reduced to utility or usefulness. Rather, it instantiates the human striving for self-realization, self-actualization. But this has to be emphasized. This defense for the autonomy of art and aesthetic values doesn't mean, on the one hand, it's autonomous, but it has to, the whole purpose of this autonomy is for human liberation and realization of our capacity, of our human nature and ideal the incarnation of what is best in the human beings. Having said that, though, it doesn't mean that art should be isolated from society, because even if art constitutes a very specific way of seeing, conceiving, and interpreting the world in order to achieve these effects I described earlier, to get people to see and not just recognize, to find themselves in what's happening around them as a part of what's happening around them. It doesn't make it something that is necessarily a result of an environment or a certain time or a certain society, right? So the autonomy of art, he would argue, is possible. It's not always just an expression of a certain specific social or cultural environment. Rather, art in this, one might think, idealized form, should you think of it as a kind of an ideal that's supposed to guide what we do as artists rather than something that can actually be achieved, I think. But in any case, the idea is that it will affect and form society and life around it by by helping us see things for what they actually are or could be. Or to use a formalist term, the function of art is to de-automate, and thereby make reality actually actual, to actualize it by sort of stripping off the dross of routinization, automation of consciousness. So in that sense, the aesthetic is an irreducible sphere. The formalists would say that art gives us a more authentic and richer experience of life, of our own time, of our culture, and of our society. Now, I know this all sounds kind of rather high-minded, but we could say that in a more pedestrian way, that art has the potential to deepen the human being's connection to the world by getting her to pay attention to real things, to reality for what it is, without interest, without seeing the phenomenon as a bearer of usefulness or utility, as a means of realizing economic or ideological aims. Chwatik writes, in that perspective, the highest value of human beings, herself, the human being herself, her free development, the full realization of her endlessly diverse possibilities. Now, this is interesting because this is the way in which this idea of art is connected to a broader sense of culture, in the sense of Bildung. Because in this way of looking at things, culture, the whole point of culture is to foster autonomous, aware, and judicious people, not demanding consumers, for instance, not Florida's creative class or high bohemians. Now, if art also happens to contribute to economic development or political stability, that's of course not a bad thing, that's a good thing. But if that's the main purpose, the aim, the goal, the function, then it's no longer art from this point of view. Now, I talked a lot about this economic aspect, but one could say that one shouldn't just see the danger in art becoming something that we consume as a product. It's not just the economic aspect that's problematic. Because if you remember the 3 T's, one of the 3 T's, aside from technology and talent, they had this third T was tolerance, which is thought to go together with this, right? The idea that openness and tolerance, what was once called liberality, sort of goes hand in hand with a kind of liberal market. And I said I wasn't going to say more about the economics of that, but I think it'd be interesting to look at this idea of art as contributing to liberality, as being enlightening and consciousness raising, in the sense of providing people with necessary cultural, let's call it cultural information, to increase tolerance and what we might call cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan point of view. Now, if the artists, and this is, I think, a point that was made earlier, if the artist sees her function as being one of enlightening, making people grasp and embrace certain ideals or values, if that's the aim of artistic activity, then, we all know the kinds of thing I'm talking about. We're talking about cultural diversity, gender equality, recognizing that we are staring in the void of a coming climate catastrophe. To make people, as I mentioned earlier, feel kind of personal responsibility for the wars and the suffering of other peoples in other parts of the world. If that's the main point of somebody's engaging in poetic writing or in dramaturgy or in choreography, then what the artist doing this is implicitly embraced two, I would say, doubtful theses. The first one being that you actually become a better human being by just consuming the right values, being exposed to them. The second is that art can remain art, even when it is just a means, an instrument for political, social fostering and moral training. And I think that these assumptions are very problematic. Which isn't to say that art doesn't have with ethics and morals, has nothing to do with ethics and morals. To the contrary, but the ethical and moral goals that can be attained are not attained by in the way that one is assumed in, say, activist art or didactic art. So it's not really clear that if we're actually teaching people to be norm critical, as it's called, in our theater productions or in our galleries, by showing that certain norms are bad, for example, certain norms about femininity, masculinity, or the behavior of the human animal in relation to other animals, and so forth. These instrumental uses don't really do much more than make explicit certain ways of thinking and speaking that already exist to a later degree as a kind of consensus among most consumers of culture, at least of high culture. So there is a risk, of course, of that one is preaching to the converted. But furthermore, and this is the deeper issue, it seems to me that this kind of preaching becomes automated in Shklovsky's sense. When we see these sorts of works of art, we're very seldom surprised or bowled over by the values we're being exposed to in these cases. We recognize them, we cognize them, and that's the sense in which they become routine. But on the other hand, in contrast, art, when it's at its best, can make the viewer, the spectator, the reader, the listener kind of unsure, uncertain, confused, unclear about where she stands. And by creating that hesitation, that doubt, at least in some people, perhaps can get them to think in a different way, to have a change of mind or change of heart after really considering, what did I see? What did that mean? What does it mean for me? But she has to do that work. But that, in that respect, it can achieve, those goals can be achieved by making people actually think about things that they normally never reflect on. But again, it's the individual, it's the audience that has to do the work, not the artist. And one of the things that's very important about this, and that's what it got a Marian point, is that if you haven't done it yourself, it's just something you possess. If I learned my norm criticism, and then the norms that I'm supposed to know have changed. For example, if we are as unfortunate as some countries have been to have a new regime, which promulgates very different values. For many people who never really considered these things for themselves, who just appropriated what they've been taught, they'll just appropriate new ideas, the ones that are de rigueur today. It's more, in that sense, it's much more effective to allow Bildung or culture to do its job just by doing its job, by just shaking us up, as it were, or breaking through the static. But then you have to ask, well, how does this happen, right? I mean, the claim I made was that by breaking through the static, by de-automating, by pushing us out of our routines, that somehow we're put in this position where we have to think and actually perceive things in a new way. How does that happen? How does this alienating from the given, from what I called poetic, artistic form, how does that occur? Ortega y Gasset makes a distinction between two kinds of art, which he means this distinction will illuminate two different ways of, or two different attitudes to art. He distinguishes between human art and artistic art. And human art appeals to us just in the sense by making us identify with what we see, or desire what we see, or just like what we see. It appeals to us in our just everyday humanity. And it builds on recognition, recognizing, and identification. So when we see in this kind of human art, when we see a play or a film, it's often because we're interested in the human fates and various motives of love and hate and joy and sorrow and victory and defeat. And to the extent that artwork creates a feeling of reality around what's happening and are being involved in them, you could say that the viewer is fascinated in a way by these images of people we'd like to meet, their passions and their pains, which we recognize in ourselves. We think that a painting of a certain landscape is beautiful because it raises in us the desire, wakes in us the desire to visit such a place. And in that respect, art is something, this human art is something that belongs to the everyday, to everyday life, the life we live when we're not reflecting all that much. The state of mind one is in when you're staring at, when you're looking at a canvas or reading a novel, it's pretty much the same state of mind you're in when you're going to work or paying your bills. Even if the secondary qualities are different from the workaday world or cleaning the house. It can be more intense, perhaps a little less instrumental, for the most part, a little bit freed from the most unpleasant consequences of real life. For example, reading a novel about a war is obviously more safer than being involved in a real war. But attention in this kind of appreciation of art is still directed in the same direction as it is in practical everyday life, to other human beings and their passions. And all of this form of artistic human art interests us because it has to do with human desires and deeds. And then in those cases, the language used, the form of language, it can't come in the way for this recognition of human deeds and actions and feelings, because if it did, then it would disturb recognition. So the practical attitude has to permeate the natural attitude has to permeate our way of seeing and looking at this kind of human art. So this more dehumanized art that Ortega talks about is the kind of art where, at the moment of perceiving the artwork, you're doing it without these emotional motives or sentiments. Whereas in this kind of human art, the whole point is to feel anger or sympathy or desire. It's not really an aesthetic appreciation for Ortega. So in this way, what he's calling human art is utterly distinct from artistic art. And he actually thinks that they're not just distinct, they can't be united in the same artwork. I think that's a bit extreme, but that is his position. So his idea is basically, and I'm going to just summarize this briefly, the idea is that if I'm looking through a window, just to look to see if the apples are growing on the tree, then the important thing is that the glass should be totally clear in order for me to see the tree. But an aesthetic appreciation would be of the kind where there's something about the glass that actually makes the tree kind of part of a more general image in which it's in a certain relationship to the frame of the window, perhaps to the kind of vague colors formed by the grass or the mud or the sky. So it makes me see something greater than just the tree. I'm seeing the garden. My attention might be drawn to some bee buzzing about. That's an aesthetic appreciation. And he says that you can't really do it at the same time. Either you really do want to see the tree and see if the apples are on it, or you're actually looking at the garden as a whole, and perhaps more than that, perhaps even the frame itself, the window frame. And that will put you in a different state of mind, where you're not aiming at anything in particular. You're actually just experiencing the garden. You could say the same thing about, say, here's another example about appreciation of a portrait of Titian, a portrait of Charles V by Titian. And you could either concentrate on things that you want to recognize, you want to recognize, right? This is the Caesar of the emperor of the German Roman Empire, Austro-Roman Empire. So that means that the referent, the historical person, Charles V, is what you're looking at. But if you actually want to see the painting as a painting, then you have to sort of put that in parentheses, that this is a portrait of Charles V. And you can't, and that was, again, his point, you really can't do this simultaneously. These are two different, what Roman Jakobson would call two different sets toward it. Two different attitudes or positionings toward the thing in front of you. So to the extent that it's a message that's already been determined at the outset, that has nothing to do with the form, that is central, that kind of artwork is less purely art for Ortega than art that is focused on its form, on its own means of expression, that is on itself. And this kind of aesthetic, this is where the aesthetic and the ethical join in artistic art, because as the Swedish philosopher Alf Ahlberg wrote, the ability to distinguish the true from the false, appearance from reality, this capacity, this ability must be, is intimately unified with a clear view of the borders of the self, on the self's limitations in relation to the world, in relation to the reality of the world. My garden is more than my desire for an apple. So if you want art to foster people, to train them in thinking the right way about things, the only way it can do that is by helping us to teaching us how to pay attention to something, to focus our view and to sharpen it. I'm just going to make this something convincing. I'm going to read a nice passage from Dostoevsky, which Dostoevsky was influential for Shklovsky's thinking. And I would say that this quote is a really perfect rendition of the formalist thesis. And it's actually a quote from one of his diaries, so it's neither a piece of literature or a piece of theory. It's just a reflection on himself. And he says this, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. I was cleaning and meandering about, approached the divan, and couldn't remember whether or not I dusted it. Since these movements are habitual and conscious, I could not remember and felt that it was impossible to remember. So that if I dusted it and forgot, that is, had acted unconsciously, then it was the same as if I had not. If some conscious person had been watching, then the fact could be established. If, however, no one was looking, or looking on unconsciously, if the whole complex lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are as if they had never been. And so, writes Shklovsky, life is reckoned as nothing. Habitualization devours work, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. So the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived, and not as they are taught or known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object, and the object is not important. That's what I had to say.